What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Board Games channel. Lately I've been tinkering around with Magic the Gathering, and my YouTube algorithm has delivered a lot of DanDan content to me lately, which is a format that I played a long time ago when I was actually a more competitive in-person playing Magic the Gathering player. And it reminded me of a lot of stuff that I did actually used to play in the day to keep myself sharp. And one of those things was mental magic. Mental magic is basically whenever you play a card, you can name any card that has the same casting cost identically, and then it is basically a copy of that spell instead. And then you're trying to always think of what's the best thing that you have for the exact scenario to try and defeat your opponent. And the way that we would play this is normally with just like a couple of boosters that had been opened from prize packs. We were like, stack all the stuff together, and then it's all jank. So the card itself is usually irrelevant, and you're always trying to think of what the best thing is. And it could be Stoneforge Mystic, it could be Tarmogoyf, it could be Lightning Bolt, and you're trying to win the game. Now, whenever we played that format, the deck was always very small. And so what would happen is we were always fighting to not be the person that lost the game due to deck count, because you're sharing a deck. Same as DanDan, you're trying to control what cards are exactly going to be on top of the deck so that you don't lose the game. And that's what has inspired this today. This is called Milled My Memoria as a meme, mostly because it has nearly every card with the word memory in the title in it. But when we were playing this mental magic format, the card that would come up a lot, weirdly, was Memory's Journey, which says target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard into their library, and it has flashback for green. This is kind of the main card that the whole idea is built around. So I'm going to do kind of a breakdown for all the different stuff, but it's a 60 card deck. Both players draw from the same deck, and there's like a couple of haymaker type cards, but the whole goal is to mill your opponent out without accidentally being the one yourself to draw from the empty library, which I think is really interesting, and it has a lot of kind of goofy stuff to it, and a lot of cards that you've probably never heard of before. But let's run through them. Let's kind of dig into it. First of all, we have our land base. So there's 22 lands. We have Breeding Pool, we have 10 Island, we have 4 Misty Rainforest. There is some contention in the DanDan format as to whether or not you should play fetches, but this deck kind of has a slightly more compelling argument because you're trying to thin the deck as fast as possible, and also we have Hedron Crab, which we'll get to later. We have the Temple of Mystery, because playing over the top of the deck is really important, and we have Willow Rush Verge. This is basically just, it will always make blue. If you've also drawn an island, you will additionally get a green. And you only sometimes need green, because there's only 7 green spells. And also, Memory's Journey flashes back for green. So let's look at our 1-drops. We've got Brainstorm. Brainstorm's kind of a DanDan all-star, because it puts cards on top of the deck after you've drawn them. But not just from the 3 that you look at, any card from your hand. So you can put any junk on top of there, any of the really expensive stuff, save it for later, and ship it over to your opponent. But also gives you information as to what's going to be in your opponent's hand. We also have Hedron Crab. So if you brainstorm a bunch of really good stuff that you want to get rid of forever, you can then just play land for turn and mill those 3 cards. You actually have a lot of control over what is on top of the deck using something like Hedron Crab, or the one-time effect Overwhelmed Apprentice, which mills 2 and then you scry 2. So you basically, okay, I've brainstormed on top, these 2 cards that I don't want anyone to have, we're going to mill them, I'm then going to scry 2, and then figure out which one is going to be the best for me to draw when it's back to my turn again, and figure out which one is the best for my opponent to draw. We also have Smuggler's Surprise. So this is an interesting one. It is a one-off. I did toy with playing second one. Maybe I will add a second one, but I really like this card because it has 3 different options, and you can pay additional mana to have extra modes. The first mode is mill 4 cards. You may put up to 2 creature and or land cards from among the milled cards into your hand, which is very, very good. The second mode is you may put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Also very, very good. In this format, there's no big stompy thing. but it essentially giving an important creature flash is the thing that is what's really important. And the last mode is creatures you control the power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible, which is much less relevant because we don't have very many big creatures, but it could come up. Let's go into our next pile. So again, DanDan All-Star Memory Lapse. So has memory in the title, plays card from top of deck. Very much fits perfectly here, but you're basically countering spells, and then it gets put on top of the deck, which means when it comes back to your turn, because you're drawing from the same deck, you are able to draw that card, which is pretty strong. And then, as you mentioned before, Memory's Journey. Now, Memory's Journey is really interesting because Memory's Journey is an instant, and it has flashback. Players share a graveyard, which means that you have to be really paying attention as to who has priority at what point, because if you put Memory's Journey on the stack, your opponent can't, stop you from doing that. So if you have the priority, then you are able to flash back the Memory's Journey. And flashing back Memory's Journey might be the thing that stops your opponent from winning with Lab Maniac, or stops you from losing by drawing from the deck. So it's kind of one of the most important cards. Next we have Narset's Reversal. This is a one-off because it's a bit of a blowout most of the time. But basically it copies an instant or sorcery spell, so you're casting the thing that your opponent just cast, and then you return that copy back to their hand. I had Remand in here originally, because it kind of feels similar, but the Narset's Reversal is a really interesting blowout because you can hit some of the bigger stuff, and then you control the action. So stuff like Smuggler's Surprise, you could be the one controlling the action instead. Next is Rift Sweeper, definitely a niche card. Now, when Rift Sweeper enters the battlefield, choose target face-up exiled card. Its owner shuffles it into his or her library. Now, this is a really interesting card in this format because it can shuffle back in a card that has been flashbacked into the deck. There is cards that will be exiling stuff. For example, Diminishing Returns will exile the top 10 cards. And Rift Sweeper is one of those ways of potentially shuffling stuff back into the deck. So if a lot of the deck has been exiled, you are able to start Rift Sweepering and putting stuff back into the deck to try and keep it alive. One of the other things that exile stuff is Scavenging Ooze. Because if you can't Memory's Journey cards back into the deck, then you're going to struggle. You're going to have a hard time trying to draw a card. And so Scavenging Ooze is really good here. And Rift Sweeper is able to shuffle back in stuff that Scavenging Ooze has exiled. But also Scavenging Ooze can potentially get to the 4 power, which means that Smuggler's Surprise can give it hexproof. Then we have Teferi's Time Twist. So this one is basically just there to dodge removal for one of your creatures, either the Crab, either the Lab Maniac, but it also gives you an extra trigger off the Rift Sweeper, which is kind of cool. So you can instant speed activate Rift Sweeper to put one card into the deck when you would be drawing from an empty library, to then draw that one card, which is kind of cool. And then we have Unsubstantiate. So it's basically 3 Unsubstantiate, 1 Narset's Reversal for like returning the spell to your hand, but Narset's gets a copy. The difference is that Unsubstantiate can hit a creature in play. Unsubstantiate, also a DanDan All-Size card, is great. But then obviously we have to include Laboratory Maniac. Now, there's only one, so there is going to be an amount of fighting over this card. But basically, if you would draw a card while there's no cards in the library, you win the game instead. And so one player is going to be trying to, fight over winning with Lab Maniac, while the other player is going to be trying to just not lose from drawing from no cards. Okay, now we have some of the powerhouse cards. Again, lots of things with memory in the title, but starting with Diminishing Returns. So each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into the library. Then you exile the top 10 cards, and then each player draws up to 7 cards. So this is a panic button kind of spell where you go, it's getting pretty close to low. I don't think I have the resources to win. I'm going to hit the reset button. And then the maths of it is, because it's a 60 card deck, you each have at least 4 lands roughly when you're minimum casting Diminishing Returns. So that's minus 8 cards. You're both going to be drawing 7 cards, which is 14 cards. So that's 22 cards. And then you exile the top 10. So that's 34 cards. So then you go to a 26 card sized library. So it doesn't restart the game, but it puts you back at a like 45% left mark, because you might be casting when you have more lands in play and stuff like that. And then that also kind of gives a tutor board, stuff to select with from the Rift Sweeper and stuff like that. Then we have Memory Deluge. This is another attempt at a blowout option because it has that same thing with the flashback. And then this is kind of how you dig for the Lab Maniac. That's why there is only a one-off. It's really strong. And so you look at the top X cards of the library, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast a spell, which would either be 4 or 7 if you're flashing it back. And then you put 2 of them in your hand, and the rest on the bottom. So because this is an instant, it has the same thing with Memory's Journey. And so you're trying to pick the right time to be able to put that onto the stack. And then here is another big blowout card. This is Selective Memory. So search your library for any number of non-land cards and exile them. So there's 22 lands. If you slam this on turn 4 and it resolves, let's say one player has 3, one player has 4, so that's 7. That means that there is 15 cards that are lands still in the deck, and that you can set the deck to be 15 cards remaining. And then every single draw from then on is going to be land, unless if you have a Rift Sweeper, unless if you've got relevant cards in hand that can interact with that. So Selective Memory is really strong, which means you can be binning the Lab Maniac as well if you've seen it in the deck. You could pick every card. You could just pick some cards like the Lab Maniac. If you see 4 Rift Sweepers in the deck, you can put 4 Rift Sweepers in exile, stuff like that. Which is really very strong, and I think is something cool to be able to fight over. And then how you make choices about this card is a form of skill expression, which I think is kind of cool. So I do appreciate it being. That's why there is a 2 of, not a 1 of. The second resolution of it's not going to do anything most of the time. So I think that's fine. And the last one is Commit to Memory. So the first half, Commit, which you cast from your hand, is put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top. Now in this format, that means that when you pass the turn, that if you're casting it in their turn, right, that player has already had their draw step, and it comes to you and you draw, and then it goes back to them and they draw that card. So if you're using it to counter something on your turn, when their counter magic or something, that means that you'll draw that card, then you kind of have to pay attention to the order of what's on top of the deck. But in the second half, Memory, which arguably is more important, you cast from the graveyard. And it has a similar problem, except it's a sorcery, so you're not fighting over it as much as Memory Deluge and Memory's Journey. But Memory says each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. So this is similar to Diminishing Returns, but it costs 6. It's a lot easier to counter this one, but it's a much more graceful version of the effect. And so that's milled My Memoria. The whole idea is that you're trying to, in the first couple of turns, generate more of an incremental advantage. In DanDan, the first couple of turns is very often just land go, and maybe if you have a DanDan, you slam a DanDan. If no one has a DanDan, then nothing kind of happens for a while. Maybe you're trying to resolve a draw spell, and a lot of the time that's not really worth fighting off. And then in the mid game, there's a big spike of interaction when you actually are potentially resolving a combat step where DanDan could connect, and you're trying to deal with all these things. Instead, with this, there's 7 good 1-drops of a creature that starts milling cards right away. So it's pretty likely to for someone to open with a crab. I think that can't be countered because there's no way to counter something that costs 1 in this deck. And then you're racing against the crab until you maybe hit the unsubstantiate for the crab, or you just kind of let it happen and you run the deck really down and then try and fight over kind of what's left. End your end step Memory's Journey to put some draw spells or counter magic back in the deck, and then you're kind of always sort of racing against the clock. Can I, last long enough to slam one of these haymakers? Can I fight over the crab? Can I fight with the counter magic? That is kind of the format. There was a few dropped cards like Logic Knot and Treasure Cruise, which would be great, but Delve is unfortunately broken in this format, because you can't respond to a lot of cards being removed from the graveyard, which is a bit rough. Scavenging Ooze is somewhat hampered by the fact that there is really only 8 green sources in the entire deck out of 22. And whilst, yes, you can find them, even if you miss your rainforest for them, there's only 2 breeding pools that are searchable with. That's specifically why I've picked a land like this. And actual combat steps, yes, whilst the Ooze can kinda punch for an amount, it's much more likely that the game is going to be win or lost through the deck being drawn. So that's the thing that's going to be much more interacted with. Hedron Crab can like block everything in the format except for Scavenging Ooze that has 2 counters on it. So if Scavenging Ooze hasn't had an opportunity to put 2 counters on it, then no combat is really going to get through because of the crab. Because it is that 0-2 toughness for the most part. So like the 1-2 Overwhelm the Apprentice is not going to get through. Rift Sweeper might get in if you don't want to block. That's kind of the format. I do really like watching the pressure build as you get quite low, and knowing that the order of the deck is the thing you're fighting over, and the size of the deck is the thing that you're fighting over, and knowing exactly how many resources you have, knowing how many cards are in the deck and stuff like that, is stuff that you're suddenly paying a lot of attention to and trying to figure out what your opponent is doing. And I think that this is a really interesting twist on DanDan. I'm going to print this up soon and start tinkering with it, start playing around with it. Might be changing some of the numbers, but I'll put an Architect link in the description for you to check this out, because it's goofy and it's fun, and it has that same DanDan feel, except the difference is that DanDan can feel a lot slower because you are relying on the combat step to kind of resolve. With this, the pressure is kind of on almost straight away, and you're trying to race to not be the person to draw from an empty library without a Lab Maniac in place. That's kind of the whole thing. If you're interested in some of the more Magic the Gathering content, this is a thing that I've started doing a bit more recently. We did a lot more when Historic was released on Magic Arena, and now that I'm kind of playing regularly again, I want to start doing a little bit more content for this for the channel. So check out the playlists and stuff that we will have out, and there's a lot of other cool stuff on there. I'm starting to do a bit more Commander content. I do have a lot of Historic and Timeless kind of content on there already, so check some of that stuff out, and hopefully I'll remember to build a deck that doesn't have the word memory in all of the cards' titles.